Hey, Curious Out Loud community. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tig. I'm your host for Curious Out Loud. Our co-host Tiff will not be joining us live today. She and her family have been honoring and celebrating the life of her grandmother this past weekend. And all our hearts here at the Curious Out Loud team go out to her and her family at this time. So Curious Out Loud is a movement to spark and engage curiosity about the lives and experiences of members of the LGBTQIA plus community and how sexuality and gender identity intersect with race, religion, culture, and politics and all the things that we call life. Our commitment is to have the difficult conversations that are so often missed out on because of our cancel culture so that we can learn how to better advocate for one another. Our vision is to create a community of connection, celebration, and compassion through these conversations. And today we're so excited to bring to you an interview that we did with Deb Rodriguez a couple of months ago. Deb is an extraordinary queer woman, healer. She's just an amazing human being who I've had the pleasure of being friends with for a few years. And today we talk with Deb about language, labels, relationship, trauma, healing, and a lot of other things. There are so many golden nuggets in this episode. So I'm excited to be sharing this with you today. Continue to stay curious, and thanks for joining us. We're so excited that you're here.
Hey, Deb, thanks for joining us today. We're so excited to have you here with us.
I am so excited to be here.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Seriously, it's an honor. I love what you guys are up to, and I love being able to contribute to the conversation.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about Deb. Who are you?
That is always the question that, stops me. You'd think I'd be better at answering that after 30 years, and yet it's still the most challenging. Deb is a very queer, witchy, service-oriented woman. I don't know how much you want me to get into me, so I'm going to give you the short version. I'm a 30-year-old cis woman living in Miami, born and raised here, and I was born into an incredibly conservative religious background. So my queerness has been a topic of controversy and conflict for most of those 30 years, as has my spirituality, because I come from such a religious background and I identify as pagan. So I'm clear that who I am is a very provocative cis woman, and I love dogs. Is that relevant?
I love animals. Most relevant. Okay, amazing. Miami, and I heard witch, so I really want to go into that. And yeah. I know that you know Tig. I really want to know how you and Tig know each other.
So Tig and I actually met. It's an amazing story. It is. We were at a transformational workshop, and the exercise was go find the person in the room who most triggers you, or that by their presentation that most freaks you out. And I think in that moment, Tig and I made eye contact. And I was like, you freak me out. And it was the beginning of such an intimate, beautiful, almost immediately, Tig. We hit it off from the get-go, and I had no idea that he was in the LGBTQ community at all. I chose him, honestly, because he's a big cis man, and my trauma is with big cis men. So
I am just laughing at the fact that Tig has attracted and is now in conversation with two cis women who were totally triggered by him when we met.
Yes, and I just want to put a disclaimer out there that I am stacking these interviews so everybody knows how amazingly awesome I am, despite the fact that I look terribly scary, apparently, because both women on the phone came into my space in such an intimate way because I triggered the fuck out of them, and because apparently I look incredibly scary. So
yeah, and you look incredibly straight. I'm sorry, I have to say it. Like, you just first appearance, like straight, white, cis male is like the appearance that you give, and like apparently triggered me and Deb, and now we're here talking about queerness. So perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's actually pretty relevant to this conversation, right? Like identity, labels, and there's so much juiciness in your story, Deb, and these labels that you grew up around and how you identify and how that contributed to your trauma and it's created conflict in your life. How labels really do two things. They allow us to be community with one another, but they also box us in a really interesting way. And I'm interested to know how labels have informed your story. When you talk about the trauma and the conflict between how you grew up and how you identify, and I'm curious to know where that conflict met within yourself and with those around you and how that manifested to create your experience.
Wow. Okay. So that's a really loaded question. And I'm going to do my best to answer it. If at any point I have gone on a tangent, please reel me back in.
Please go on your tangent.
Okay. I'm going to start by saying that labels and fluidity sometimes are very contradictory. And for me, getting to know myself has been accepting that I am a fluid being. And so that means that yesterday I might identify as lesbian, and tomorrow I identify as queer, and the next day I identify as pansexual, and the next day I identify as fill in the blank. And so for me, the labels were important at the beginning because growing up, I really was made to believe that who I was inherently wrong because I was fluid, because I was attracted to people and genders that conservative religion taught me was wrong. And so when I started to actually step out of my family's religious environment, that's when I started to be in the question of, okay, who am I? And that's when labels really supported me. That's when identifying as lesbian made me feel good because all of a sudden I had power over who I said that I was. And for 18 years I felt powerless in deciding who I was and what made me holy. If anything, my authenticity I was taught that it was unholy. So being able to take language back was really important. I think where it stopped being effective and where it stopped supporting me is that then I became attached to being lesbian. And that then became rigidity instead of fluidity. So when I started to notice that, wait a second, now all of a sudden I'm in a relationship with a trans man. I'm not a lesbian then. Okay, so then I'm judging myself because I'm attracted to someone that doesn't fit within my label. And that's when it stopped being ineffective. And honestly, that's when I adopted the current label, which is queer. Not only because I think it acknowledges that there are more than two genders, so bisexual doesn't fit the bill for me, but I think it also honors the fluidity of I'm all of it, and I choose who I love on the daily and on the hour, and it has nothing to do with a label. So language is important. Labels are important for me when it helps me to get my power back. It stopped being effective for me when it took my power away. And honestly, I think a little bit of that was also the judgment that exists within the LGBTQ community. Because I remember when I identified as lesbian and all of a sudden I was like, you know what, but we do strap-ons. We play with strap-ons. And I remember the woman that I was in conversation with was a group of women, of cis women, and they all identified as lesbian. They judged me for using a strap-on because it wasn't lesbian, because it was a cock. And you need to choose a side already. And if you chose self-identified women, then therefore you cannot play with these things or anything that is tying into the masculine. So it also became a space within the queer community where I was experiencing the same kind of divisive, judgmental energy that I experienced outside of the queer community. So I think that when those experiences started to happen where I was being rejected and judged for the labels I was assuming within the queer community, it was a big fuck it moment for me, and I made up whatever the hell language resonated with me, which is why I also chose the word witch. because I really I'm creating language to kind of encompass who I am, while also really acknowledging that language cannot encompass all of who I am. Did that make sense?
Wow.
I mean,
freaking beautiful.
I literally have chills. I mean, you tapped into so much of what I've been working on. You know, I've been really exploring this idea of love and connection and how it relates to trauma and how we define love, right? Like, is non-romantic love different from romantic love, aside from the fact that we're intimate with romantic partners? And no matter how you identify or how you label, how is your love different from one gender to the next? And I think that you just said something so incredibly profound and beautiful.
Yeah, there's so many layers here, Deb, and I think what you're saying is so powerful in all these different domains that overlap. I really want to ask you what witch means, but I'm going to save that question. Something that I'm curious about that what you said brought up for me is I'm hearing that how you identify was connected to who you were dating or who you were in love with. And there's also the part about gender and how that ties into identity as well. What is the distinction for you about, you know, kind of how you identify as a person and how you identify when you're in relationship with someone?
Oh my gosh. So I love that all of your questions are so poignant. Like, each one of your questions makes my ass clench in the best way, because they're so thoughtful. And honestly, that has been an answer that's been developed with time, because I think that my experience as a queer woman within the LGBTQ community is that for the most part, most folks within this community bring some kind of trauma. And so when it came to being in relationship with others, I was really quick to give my power away, including the labels that I assumed and the language that I assumed within relationship. So to your point, if I was dating a cis woman, I'm a lesbian. And honestly, at one point, the language became kind of like an armor. Oh, I'm a lesbian. Please accept me. Other lesbians who use the word lesbian, because of the experience of this woundedness within the queer community of I really desire to be accepted and nurtured because in the past I was rejected for my authenticity. So I'm hoping that by giving you my power, you'll give me the love that I need. And I'm willing to change how I identify and the language I use if that means that you're going to love me too. And so I know that for a while there I clung to the label of a lesbian because I attracted community that was the language they used. And as a way of avoiding, and I'm kind of air quoting this, avoiding conflict, I continued to use the language even though I had stopped identifying as lesbian. At this point in my experience, I identify as queer, full stop. And it has nothing to do with a person's gender, how they identify, their orientation. Point in case, I went on a date with a cis man who is the embodiment of heteronormative everything. And in that relationship, in the dating, still very much being clear around, and I identify as queer, and I'm very fluid. And I do believe that I have masculine and feminine energy within me, and they're integrated. So, yes, I'm attracted to you, and also my attraction, my orientation, and my fluidity is so much bigger and encompassing than cis men who are hypermasculine. Just want to let you know. So at this point, it's really important for me to vocalize that and let people know, not just because I want to educate people, and what a beautiful opportunity to date a cis men hyper-masculinized community, the very thing that triggers me. What an opportunity to use my voice to not only allow myself to be witnessed, but to educate them into, hey, this is a community and we don't have cooties.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question?
Totally answers my question. And what's beautiful about it is that I feel like as babies, you know, when you're like young and gay, then you go through these transformations. And I'm hearing your beautiful journey of going from I'm identifying because I want love and acceptance, and that's how I'm giving and taking. And then you've like grown into, this is who I am, full stop, and I can love whoever I want, and it doesn't affect my identity. And that's very beautiful. And I'm going to get really curious and be like, how do you have conversations with your hyper-masculine cis man you're dating about queerness?
Yes, because it's impossible to get to know me and not get to know queerness. I, this week, spent the night at his apartment, and what did I watch on Netflix? I watched AJ and the Queen, which is RuPaul glamour all day. And so this man walks in, and what does he see on the screen? A bunch of beautiful queens dancing on stage. And that provoked conversation because he was genuinely interested in, are those men or are those women? And me being able to sit down and go, well, first of all, they're both drag queens, still identify as men, and yet they perform as women. And when they are performing, I'm not generalizing, in this show, their pronouns change from he, him to her, hers.
Yeah, I see that a lot. You said that labels can't embody the full spectrum of who you are. And I'm going to go even further and say that labels can't embody the full spectrum of human experience, right? We're so much more than what a label can define. So AJ and the Queen, wow, my kids love that show. I mean, I don't know that it's kid appropriate, but my kids keep asking me, when is the next season coming out? It was so fun to watch it with them because they would ask me the same thing. Is that a man or is that a woman? And I had the same conversation with them, right, about it's both, because there is that fluidity. And again, not to like generalize and speak for the drag community, but my experience of the drag community has been when these performers are out of drag, they identify as men, and when they are in drag, they 100% identify as women.
Yes, and honestly, part of the power that I'm seeing in these conversations is that sometimes these conversations don't need to be saturated in conflict and tension and seriousness, because I'm having conversations with people who aren't necessarily versed in the queer community, and it ended up being a very joyful, playful, thoughtful conversation. Instead of what I've done in the past, which is, this is so serious to me and it has been so ridden with conflict that now I'm going to get really tense and really serious, and I'm going to bring that energy into the conversation. And so now people who exist outside of it pick up on that, and I'm creating a space where they feel other, which is just perpetuating the very culture that I'm being a stand to step out of, which is unity consciousness. I'm not about the other. So why am I bringing otherness into conversation?
Right. Like what's coming up for me when you say that is the difference in the energy between schooling someone and educating someone, right? Like it's great to be educated and to understand each other's experiences, but it's a completely different energy to feel as though you're being schooled.
I agree. Totally. And, I think what you said is, what you highlighted is so important, because being othered within our community, it hurts a little bit more than being othered by people not in our community that don't have any of the language. But when you're like coming into yourself, and I get this experience from some friends who have been hetero for a really long time, and then they didn't really grow up in the queer community, and they step in, and they feel really isolated because they don't have the language to describe all of their feelings or what's happening, and they're still shedding a lot of the heteronormative rules of engagement in the world. So there's that transitional period that people are in that you're speaking into. And also earlier I heard you say something about men performing as women, and I'm curious about how performance is a part of our daily life, like how we were given choice about two genders, and we were taught to perform either more feminine or more masculine, and those are also performances, not just on stage but in our daily life and how we perform with our family and how we perform with our friends and how we perform within the community. And so I'm curious about your thoughts about how we can bridge the gap between educating and like schooling someone and being able to be what we stand for, which is love.
In a sentence, I would say return to your wholeness. Return to your wholeness. Return to your wholeness. Because the reality is that we have internalized the conversations that we heard growing up. To your point of schooling versus educating, that's a defense mechanism. I've learned that who I am authentically creates conflict, and so my way of protecting myself is to inflate myself and go into this righteous space of I'm better than you because I feel inferior to you. And so transformation on a collective will not happen until we heal on an individual basis. So return to your wholeness. And why I'm saying return to wholeness instead of return to healing is because healing implies that something is broken. Queer people aren't broken. Mm-hmm. We have been raised, for the most part, in a culture that doesn't understand queerness because it exists in binary, it exists in duality. And I'm going to put it this way. In my experience, a lot of the queer community were like 8-pointed stars that were born into families of triangles. And so the triangles didn't know what to do with 8-pointed stars, so they squished them into the mold of triangle. Not because they were necessarily trying to control or possess or destroy, but because their only way of connecting or understanding was through triangle. Once we get that our authenticity has been on a subconscious level anchored to conflict and anchored to I am not safe, we get to start doing the work to heal that so that our authenticity is now anchored to I am safe. And until we do that work, it doesn't matter who we're in conversation with, we're going to get triggered when we're authentic. And so now we're having a conversation with a cis hetero man who is completely oblivious and going, hey, are they men or women? And because it's our authenticity, we immediately go onto the defensive and project onto this person, oh my God, I'm being judged, so I'm going to puff up and now I'm going to school them because this is the only way that I know how to keep safe. And what we forget to bypass there is like, okay, let's acknowledge that what's coming up for this queer person is that they don't feel safe in their authenticity and that perhaps their trigger is this cis man. Like we joked about at the beginning of the call, that Tig was our trigger because we were projecting onto him our past trauma. So until we take our power back from our past, it's going to be really, really challenging and really difficult to be able to create unity and connection in our present. And I think part of why there's so much division within and without the queer community, which I agree with you, Tiff, that it was a little more disappointing and heartbreaking when I experienced the rejection and the rigidity from within the queer community. Because for me it was wait, but you already know what exile feels like. You already know what it's like to be told that who you are is an abomination and unworthy of love, so why are you doing this? Whereas it was easier to almost like, yeah, you don't get it because you're not queer. And so to experience that, I think for me, what I have turned that into is, damn, I kept looking for spaces that would save me. And so when I started to identify as queer, I gave the queer community my power. And I thought, you guys are going to be the ones who rescue me. You're going to make me feel whole. You're going to make me feel safe. And when the community didn't, I had the opportunity to then become that space for myself. And it was only in that work that now I'm able to show up in different spaces, comfortable in my queerness, because I've taken my power back.
Yeah, that's amazing. How has recognizing and embracing your fluidity informed your path to healing your past trauma and returning to wholeness?
Oof. Okay. Honestly, it set me free. And it's been really interesting to witness myself because for almost a decade, I was only in relationship with people who were really, 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 really feminine. And by feminine, I mean very connected to their heart, emotive, sensual, creative, intuitive. And that meant that I remained mostly in my masculine. And my masculine I define as the logic, the linear, the strategy, the structure, the go, 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 the hustle, the action. And so for 10 years, I got to essentially heal my relationship with the feminine, which was learn how to connect to my own emotions by learning to connect to my partner's emotions, learning how to slow down and play because my partner's made time for play. And now I find myself in an experience where I'm really wanting to exist and explore being in my feminine, which is where my trauma is, because my trauma was I was sexually abused and molested for the first 7 years of my life by an uncle. And my grandmother, who was present every single time, did nothing to stop it. So I have trauma with both feminine, masculine. My conversation with the feminine, what I made up about it was it's impotent, it's weak, it doesn't protect me. What I made up about the masculine is it exploits me and it isn't safe, but it has power. So I'd rather stay in my masculine and be a masculine woman and only date people who are in their feminine so that I can remain here. And so now what I'm noticing is that deliberately stepping into my feminine, my heart, my emotions, my creativity, and being in relationship with masculine cis men, what comes up for me is, oh my God, I don't want to speak up. Oh my God, I don't want to create conflict. Oh my God, I don't actually trust. It's making me aware of my trauma points. Like all of my triggers are coming up. The distinction is that now I'm aware that those triggers are coming up and I'm getting to vocalize anyway. So how it's informed in my life is that it's completely revolutionized everything. I'm really getting just how integrated I am. And so now I flow in that too. And I design my life around that flow. Okay, I'm going to get my period the last week of February. That means that the week before, I tend to get really, really emotive. I tend to get really creative, and I tend to get really sensitive. So you know what? The week before my period, I'm not going to see clients. I'm not going to do any work with one-on-ones. I'm only going to do creative projects that week. So it literally is now deciding what even my schedule looks like. So my fluidity is allowing me to design my life in a way that honors my flow instead of sticking to rigidity, which is a hyper-masculinized way of doing things. Like, no, we don't account for your emotions. We don't account for your seasons. You just got to constantly be producing. Nah, the feminine accounts for the seasons. We have winter, we have spring, we have summer. So I'm going to honor my feminine and my seasons and use my masculine, my logic, to support that flow instead of to restrict it.
Wow. That's amazing. So how do you support people in also finding that flow and that fluidity?
First, by making them aware that they've done the best they could with the tools and the consciousness that they had available at the time. So forgiving that, hey, maybe you didn't know better, and that's okay because you learned this behavior and you've actually been trying to protect yourself with the tools that you were given. It just means that now you've outgrown those tools. So this isn't an invitation to judge. If anything, it's an invitation to notice that it's amazing that you've outgrown the consciousness that you were born into. Fantastic. And slowly beginning to teach people how to self-regulate. Like we get to really honor that a lot of the queer community has trauma. And that's not something to just bypass by you've got to create the perfect yoga pose and you need to go to mindfulness events and then you're just going to be fine. No, it's getting that for the most part when we're talking about the queer community, and frankly, even outside of the queer community, authenticity has been made to be the unsafe space. And so teaching folks how to regulate through things like tapping, like breath work, so that they're supporting their nervous system and their body to also communicate to their brain, hey, I'm being authentic and I'm safe. And it's understanding that the way that the mind works is it is constantly trying to prove us right. But if our implicit belief is that I am not worthy and I am not safe, then our mind is constantly scanning our experiences, our relationships for evidence that that's true. So it's almost like you go to the store and you pick out red sunglasses and you put them on. It does not matter what you look at or what the color is of what you look at. It's always going to be tinged red. And so it's getting that our past experiences have created implicit beliefs. There's a saying that goes, the way you speak to your children becomes their inner voice. So beginning to reflect on, how did your caregivers speak to you? Did they wrong you when you were your authentic self? Did they shame you? Because more likely than not, that's now how you respond to your authenticity, and then you project that onto your experiences and your relationships. So becoming aware of those implicit conversations, those core beliefs first, shrouding it in compassion, and then supporting them with tools like how to self-regulate your nervous system, how to communicate and make requests, how to then co-regulate and let other relationships show up for us, so that we're also getting evidence that I'm safe in my authenticity now. I can let people in now. And that's a fucking process. And usually that process means going to our shadow, to what feels like hell, to our trauma. I've started to explain trauma like and authenticity kind of like you're walking into a daisy field, and it feels like you're walking into a minefield. And we get to account for how our body and our mind responds as if we're in danger. And then supporting on a mind, body, spirit level so that we create a different reality instead of remaining hostage to what we were told, because it doesn't serve us anymore. And honestly, like to quote RuPaul, we're all born naked, the rest is drag. Like there is no distinction between queer community and non-queer community. And back to your point, it's a label. And I think there's one of two ways to experience source, universe, life, whatever language you want to give it. One is separation consciousness, which is the fear-based, they're other, and it's me, and it's different, and that's one way, valid, cool. And usually it comes with a lot of anxiety and a lot of depression and a lot of anger. And valid. The other way is unity consciousness, which instead of fear-based is love-based, and getting that everything outside of us is a continuation of what exists within us. Therefore, everyone is divine. And it has zero to do with their label, their orientation, their, like, zero. So it's a return to wholeness.
Yeah, that's amazing. So one of the big missions of
so much right now. Wow.
I know, seriously.
I'm mind blown. Like I have no words at the moment.
I mean,
Yay.
one of the most important missions, I think, of Curious Out Loud is learning how to best advocate for one another. You know, when you think about these gaybies, as Tiff calls them, these young queer people, you know, I've done work with the California organization in New York City, which is the largest homeless gay youth organization in the world. And the stories that I've heard, so many incredible youth that I work with who are homeless, how do we best advocate for each other within the community? How do we best advocate for these young kids that are coming into a world that is telling them, be loud and proud and be who you are, and it gets better, and we're championing authenticity, and it's being received by these youth who are in environments that aren't necessarily safe for them to be authentic. So with that in mind, how do we best advocate for one another in this environment that we're in?
The word that comes to mind is allowing, because you made such a thoughtful point. There is this movement right now, which I appreciate, of let's be out, let's be proud, this is who we are, hear us roar. And to your point, there are queer youth who it actually isn't safe to be out and proud and here's who I am. And it's also okay to not know who you are yet, whether you're 15 or 55. Like there's this attachment back to the label of who am I? And I need to figure out who I am, and I've got to come up with a label because it's my way of creating control where I'm feeling emotionally out of control. So who am I? And so it's the blessing and the curse of this movement right now of like queerness, which again, I love that there's a space for it, and it's provoking conversation. And I feel like it's also creating this immense amount of pressure for younger generations and younger communities of, okay, if I'm going to be queer, I've got to be like this, though. It's got to look like this. And so once again, you're breaking a mold to step into another. I think the best way to advocate is, again, for me, it's always about do the work with you and get that you are whole regardless of whether people understand you or not. Where it gets muddy is when we judge ourselves for the experience that we're having. If you're feeling overwhelmed, let yourself be overwhelmed. If you're angry, let yourself be angry. If you're confused, let yourself be confused. So back to the allowing for seasons. I think it's as simple as when we are amongst community that we want to support, going, hey, how can I support you? And not assuming that every queer person has the same dilemma and needs the same support. Like that, using our voice to how can I support you? We get to just remove this pressure of I need to know. There needs to be clarity. I need to be clear. And I need to know what label I am in order for me to create connection. I think the more we start moving away from what we think it's supposed to look like and we just allow things to be, and where we start doing a better job of using our voice, that's when connection's going to be possible. Because honestly, I've had moments where I'm hurting, I don't know where to go, I don't know where to turn, and I'm sitting with someone and it's already traumatic for me to be vulnerable because that's where my wound is. So I'm finally being vulnerable and the response is, oh, here's what you need to do. No, that's not how I needed to be supported in that moment. For me, what has best been an advocate has been learning to use my voice to be specific about my requests. Hey, I'm having a rough day. Can you listen to me for 15 minutes? And when I'm done, can you hug me and tell me everything's going to be okay and tell me the things you admire about me? Because today I feel like a loser, and today I don't feel like I've got any of it together. So the best way, I think, is beginning to learn what support looks like for us on an individual level, and then using our voice to make requests of the people who have earned the right to see us, how they get to support us.
Asking, I think, is so paramount, right? Like, so I think so often we're so ready to jump in and be like, okay, I'm going to support you, and this is how I'm going to do it, without even saying what would support you right now.
Valid point that a lot of us don't know what support looks like. So I would say start being in the question of what support looks like. How many times I've been asked, okay, how can I support you? And I'm like, I don't know.
What does that even mean?
Again, like, right, what do you mean? And so it, again, is a return to the self first. Like, okay, Deb, how do I want to be supported? And slowly discovering, and it was a messy process and it continues to be, oh, when I'm sad, I like to be held. When I'm angry, I like to be verbally acknowledged, but do not hug me. So it also depends, again, back to the fluidity. Depending on where I am, support looks different. So start to notice what support looks like for you so you can be an advocate for you.
That's awesome. So back to being an advocate for oneself. That I think that's one of the most powerful messages that's coming from this project is really supporting people in advocating for themselves.
Yes,
awesome.
Which is, I think in one hand it's so empowering, and in another it's also disappointing, right? Because I'll speak for myself. It's but wait, I was hoping that someone was going to come save me. I was hoping that something was going to come rescue me. And so you're saying that by me being an advocate for me, once again, it's just me. I do acknowledge that on the one hand, there gets to be the grieving and the disappointment of, all right, it's not going to look like the way that I wanted it to, and I was really hoping that someone would come and save me. And now that I've grieved that, I'm going to step into my power and celebrate that I am able to be the person that I've been searching for. And I say this because there is this notion that to be empowered means you only feel good things, and that's false. Like just this morning, I had breakdown and I was crying because I felt alone. And I'm able to witness it now and go, oh, okay, this is my inner child story who feels alone, and really that isn't true. So what I'm going to do right now is call my best friend, tell her how I'm feeling, and ask her to love into me so that I'm creating connection in a moment when I feel disconnected. But it would be a lie to say that you being an advocate for yourself is going to feel good and that empowerment is going to feel good. No, a lot of times it feels like grief and it feels like disappointment and it feels like heartbreak because our inner child is grieving the fact that no caregiver is going to come be a stand for me or save me or rescue me. That means I get to do the work. And yeah, that's exhausting and it's scary, and you are powerful enough to be that for you. And you being an advocate for you doesn't mean that you're alone. There is a distinction between loneliness and solitude. Solitude is sacred, where you feel safe with yourself. You've created a safe environment. You with you, your relationship with yourself is healthy, versus loneliness, which is I am not enough for myself. And getting that even in healthiness, we're going to have moments of, I feel lonely. But in those moments, being able to have the tools and the voice to reach out to community and to relationships so that they can show up for us. And the person I called was not in the queer community.
Oh, my God. I just want to keep talking to you. This is definitely, I can see that we're going to be having lots more conversations. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, you are such a light. I mean, you know, you've played a very special role in my life and my transformation and my own pathway to healing. And I'm so grateful and honored to be able to share that with other people. You've been such an important part of my life, and I'm so grateful that you've been with us today.
I'm honored, and I would love to do 6 million more of these conversations. I do want to wrap up by giving some tangible tools to whoever's listening so that they can walk away with a way to self-soothe, and I'm going to offer these 3 steps. The first is acknowledge that your ego is your inner child, and your inner child has fear. And so when that voice comes up, get that it is a broken little child who's crying because they feel unsafe. So acknowledge that inner child with compassion. I named mine Rosita. Give that inner child a name. And the second is think about how you would respond if one of your friends showed up crying or hurting in the way that your inner child is crying and hurting. What advice would you give them? Would you wrap them up in a blanket? Would you listen to them and then tell them that they're amazing? Frame it that way first and then show up for yourself that way. Because the intimacy that you desire is with you. You get to create an environment for that inner child to feel safe. You're not doing anything wrong. You're doing the best that you can with the tools that you were given. It just means that you've outgrown them. So start to notice what your inner child's fears are and what that feels like in your body. It usually feels like anxiety or fear. And give that inner child a name so that you start to divorce yourself from that voice. It isn't you, it's a part of you. Start to slowly maybe find a picture of yourself as a little kid. Make that your screensaver so that you're starting to access compassion for this inner child, this little child who's worthy of your compassion, not your judgment. And you're getting to reparent yourself and show up as the caregiver that you needed, and one day at a time.
Amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I just have to say that getting to know you in this way is such an honor and a privilege because it's our first conversation. I learned so much from you. I feel really hopeful that there are people like you in the world who stand for wholeness, and your whole message about returning to your wholeness so that you can move through the world and be a stand for that. And I think that's so beautiful. I love this. So thank you for being here. And where can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram as Debbie Magic, on Facebook as Debbie Magic, or www.debbiemagic.com. So I kept it really simple. And I do want to say thank you to both of you, not only for that really generous outpouring of love, which I still receive, and honestly is like medicine to me today, so thank you. And I also really, really acknowledge the both of you for what you're creating, and you can absolutely count on me to have as many conversations as needed, because I do experience this as soul medicine. What you two are up to is needed. I'm honored that you've included me in it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Deb.
Thank you.
Love you both.
Love you too.